Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and another playlist that we are about to now launch and post at LearnStrong.net. We are calling this playlist Sister Wisdom, a study of female-only authors. Now the genesis of this project, I want to get this out of the way right away, is the American poet Denise Fletcher. She's the architect of this playlist, and I'm grateful for the work that she has done here. We have all kinds of lectures that we've posted at LearnStrong.net, and of course many of those are classics of what we will often humorously refer to as the dead white males. But we've also given a large number of lectures. I say large, clearly not large enough, all right? But a large number of lectures of females and female voices, and so we have decided to put together this list for those of you who will be interested in studying such important voices in chronological order. Now, the origination of our title here, Sister Wisdom, comes from our study of the book of Proverbs, of course, chapter 7 and verse 4. Quote, "Say unto wisdom, thou art my sister, and call understanding thy kinswoman." End quote, of course, the King James 1611 version of that passage. Now, why this playlist? Well, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Go back, for example, and take a look at our comments on the great Tilly Olson in her classic essay, Silences, where she makes this interesting argument that it's not that there haven't been female artists and voices, it's that often they were silenced by virtue of the fact that the publishing houses, obviously owned and run by a very small group of individuals, almost always male, disallowed any kind of inclusion in the quote-unquote canon by female voices. And of course, until the 20th century, this was obviously a serious problem for us. I also want to remind ourselves of that great essay, Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Garden, and the argument that she makes there, that women have always been artists, but artists often outside of the general academic kind of social setting. So, for example, growing gardens or weaving any number of tapestries or quilts have always been a function and a part of female creativity. But here we're going to be focusing, of course, predominantly on those actual voices and the classic texts and, of course, the stories. Now, if you are at all familiar with our stuff at LearnStrong.net, there are some assumptions that always are going to be a part of any lecture that we'll be sharing. Let's go through it really quickly. First of all, excuse me, and so importantly for this series of lectures, let's say it again. It's one of those mantras of 303, right? We'll often say that the new is the new, the N-E-W is the K-N-E-W. And the reason we argue this is, of course, because we are actually the stories that we tell. We're the stories we retell. We are as well the stories that we decide, both individually and collectively, to accept or to reject. And obviously, when you go through this playlist, you will see the powerful ways in which stories that were considered to be absolutely true are challenged and ultimately become rejected by society, and with good cause. But it doesn't mean that we don't understand those stories. We are going to appreciate those stories. Now, of course, our learning theory is foundational to everything that we'll try to attempt to do in 303. That capacity to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. And as you sit down and go through this playlist, as I hope that you will, we're always going to be emphasizing what learning is actually taking place here. Of course, we're going to apply our learning theory to our reading theory, to our annotative theory, where we're always messing around with any text on at least 3 levels. At level 1, what does the text say? Here we're just summarizing. At level 2, what does the text mean? We will subdivide to a themes, messages, to be rhetoric. Not what Emily Dickinson says, but for example, how she says it. So much of reading Dickinson's work, and obviously other voices as well, is to appreciate this rhetorical approach. Finally, at level 3, we're going to ask, how can I relate to this information in meaningful ways? And here I will thank one of my great teachers, the great Barbara D. Bernard, one of the great voices, feminist voices at the University of Nebraska, who always argued that until you can relate to other voices, you really do not have a story of your own to tell. And it's such a brilliant insight. And so at 3A, we're going to ask, how does this information that I'm reading relate to other texts that I'm familiar with, that I know of? Notice we've already, for example, mentioned Proverbs 7:4. We're always looking to relate other texts. And again, text for us is a very holistic kind of term. That is to say things that you've read, but also things you've been exposed to in terms of your listening and viewing and obviously other kind of creative enterprises as well. And then finally at 3B, and most significant, certainly for this project, since we're calling this Sister Wisdom, and the hope is obviously to acquire wisdom, that love of philosophy, right? That love of Sophie, right? We're going to ask, of course, how does it relate to me personally? Can I have a personal connection? And as we've often said, you do not have to be male to be able to work to have some relationship to female voices. And so our hope is that with each one of these titles, with each one of these lectures, that you can feel some way to connect at a personal level. Of course, we're also assuming some knowledge of what we will call in room 303 our big five. In other words, anytime we pick up a text, we'll always ask about 5 kind of important perspectives on the text, right? The first for us is epistemology. That is to say, what does the text say about knowledge and what we can know? Of course, there is an absolutist epistemological position. I know, and if you don't agree with me, you're wrong. Of course, there's a tremendous danger in the absolutist epistemological position. And of course, this position can be held on both sides of the political spectrum, no question. But it's a very dangerous position to hold, as we have often said in 303. People fly airplanes into buildings and lots of people die because of this absolutist kind of epistemological perspective, and we want to try to distance ourselves from it. But as well, on the opposite end of the epistemological spectrum, we don't want to embrace some kind of relativist position that says there are no absolutes, there is no truth. Because in the moment we say there is no truth, we're obviously postulating a truth. That is to say there are no truths. That's what we call the performative contradiction, and so we're always looking, and of course we're going to learn this so powerfully in the study of these female voices. We're always looking for the fallibilist position. It is, of course, the position of originally the Enlightenment science, and it said what? I think I'm right about anything I think I know, but I could be wrong. And it's that I could be wrong part that makes it science. When science becomes absolutism, it's no longer science but scientism. And of course, then we're right back to the problems that during the Enlightenment that were pointed out through that process of the differentiation of the value spheres, as we talk about it in lectures elsewhere at learnstrong.net. From epistemology, we of course go to ontology, the question of who am I and who are you? And when we come together, who are we? We have a lot of reliance, of course, on integral philosophy here and the great Ken Wilber and his ideas of the 4 quadrants notion. We've talked about that elsewhere, but we're always looking to see an inside and an outside perspective that's both singular as well as plural. And so we're always asking these ontological questions that especially lead to, of course, issues of value. How do we decide to value what we value? And of course, we're going to hear so much of this in these lectures on regarding female voices. Of course, of our big 5, 3 and 4, psychology and sociology, are 2 sides of the same coin, right? That is to say, psychology, study of the individual mind; sociology, study of the collective mind. And we're always looking at issues like motivations. Why do people behave the way they behave, for example? And obviously fears and how we relate to those fears and overcome those fears. Finally, the question of theodicy, Theodicy, Theo, God, DK, justice. That question of why must there be pain and suffering in this world? And we are going to see this all the way through so many of these lectures. Of course, female voices, oppressed oftentimes and needing to respond in some way, will speak to the question of pain and suffering. But what we will see again and again is, of course, the theodicy that we in 303 try to embrace. When terrible things happen, we have to teach ourselves, learn to stop asking, why did this happen to me? And learn to ask, why did this happen for me? The great poet, young poet Amanda Gorman, is the very last poet listed in our list. And her amazing poem, The Hill We Climb, which is, of course, read and performed at President Biden's inauguration day. And I think it's fundamentally right that we end there. Why? Because the theodicy that she will in fact suggest is we've got to take all of the pain of our nation and we have to find some way to use it. Why did it happen for us, not why did it happen to us? Now there's any number of key high points in this playlist, and there's any number of ways to approach the study. I mean, I just mentioned that we'll finish with Amanda Gorman. It's a remarkable list to think we start with Bradstreet, go through Mary Wollstonecraft, and we finish with Amanda Gorman. I mean, just think about those three names alone, and the trajectory in terms of chronology. You can play that game. You can always start by looking at the list in your favorite writers. Obviously, we've got lectures there from Emily Dickinson. I would recommend a couple right away because so many students have been blown away by the voices that are presented there in Elizabeth Bishop's classic, The Fish, as well as Denise Levertov's A Tree Telling of Orpheus. For my money, one of the greatest poems ever written, and we've enjoyed that conversation from that lecture, so you can always jump in that way. You can work any order that you wish. You don't have to go chronological. You can go from Amanda Gorman's The Hill We Climb and go backwards. It's a fascinating way to study. What are we always looking for in the end? Well, final comments here. We're always looking to grow. We're always looking to find new ideas that we can share with others, and of course, in that exchange, we become then no longer living isolated, but we become part of community. And in the end, that, of course, is what Sister Wisdom is all about. Community, to find ways to grow together so that we are able to become better, both as individuals and obviously as a society. I hope that you enjoy this playlist and you gain some wisdom along the way. Thank you.